Well, a trans man might be excluded from the women-only service if the service provider decides that because he presents as a man, other service users could reasonably object to his presence, and it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim to exclude him. So, like, you can exclude a trans man from being in a men's-only service because that person is technically a biological woman in their eyes, but you can also exclude a trans man from a women-only service because that woman doesn't sufficiently look enough like a woman to you. That's essentially what they're saying. Because he presents as a man, I guess they're gonna have like a governmental body that's meant to lay out the rules and regulations behind how men are supposed to look and present themselves in public, and how women are supposed to look and present themselves in public. Like, how are people expected to be able to follow these absurd guidelines? Like, you gotta lay it out at least. I think the UK government should have to do that, because otherwise it's so gray area. You could just deny any trans person from using any facility and make it so that they're not really able to exist in public comfortably, which might be the goal. You know them, you love them, everybody. It is the UK, the spawn point of what eventually became the United States of America. They're just always trying to do their best to become culturally relevant in the geopolitical scene ever since the US separated itself, sawed itself off of Great Britain's control, and has outdone them in nearly every way, especially the bad ways. The UK was like, all right, we got to find a way to like make ourselves unique. How do we do this? I know the US is already really transphobic. The powers that be in the US are also really not a big fan of trans people's existence. However, we've got a lot of old women that don't like trans people, specifically trans women. And we also have the author of a children's book series that is very vocal about not liking trans people. So we found our way in. Let's be even more transphobic than America, at least for a time. They got a lot of competition with the current administration. This is from August 7th, a couple days ago at time of recording. Ban trans women from single-sex spaces, equality, quote-unquote, watchdog to say. The Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance to be submitted to ministers this month will tell schools, hospitals, leisure centers, and cinemas to limit trans access. Schools, hospitals, leisure centers, and cinemas will be told to ban trans women from using single-sex spaces, including lavatories and changing rooms, under Equality's guidance to be submitted to ministers this month. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, we talked about them in the past on this channel, is understood to have rejected demands from campaigners to water down rules that would restrict the ability of trans people to access services of their chosen gender. The statutory guidance will spell out that transgender competitors can be excluded from single-sex sporting competitions, and that it would be reasonable for a woman to object to the presence of a transgender woman if she will be getting undressed or in a vulnerable situation. Don't worry about the transgender woman that would then potentially be getting undressed or in a vulnerable situation around biological men, as it were. There's never really been any kind of problem with that, right? You don't need to worry about the comfortability of the trans people because they're not full humans, you know? It's totally fine to treat them as a secondary kind of human-animal offshoot that doesn't fully qualify for moral consideration. The guidance applies to any organization that provides services to the public. Shops and gyms will be included in its scope, but the guidance also extends to government departments, the NHS, and prisons. It covers private organizations or charities if they are providing a public service, for example, a private care home providing care on behalf of a council. The EHRC will submit its updated guidance to Bridget Phillipson, the Women and Equalities Minister, before the end of the month. It is believed Phillipson will approve the guidance as long as it is in line with the law. It will then be laid before Parliament. If I told you to close your eyes and imagine a British woman, here we are. The guidance will not radically differ from a draft published when the EHRC launched its consultation on changes after a Supreme Court ruling in April, which said women and sex must be defined in terms of biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, because they are very excited about weaponizing, in the same way that the transphobic TERF movement, also not very feminist, but is aping the aesthetics of feminism and the language of feminism in order to try to institute bigoted policies and whatnot against trans people and essentially remove them from public life entirely. They're also going to do so in this way. They're going to bastardize this kind of terminology, like calling it the Equality Act, because for some reason it's an attempt to reach a kind of equality to enforce that trans people should be excluded from gyms, shops, etc., when it comes to bathrooms or changing rooms or sports teams. We're trying to achieve true equality here. Many organizations, including some NHS trusts and the civil service, have said they are waiting for the guidance before implementing changes. A source with knowledge of the Consultation told the Times, quote, "The law is the law is not going to change." Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Transgender campaigners have claimed the changes will breach their human rights and promise to bring legal challenges. God be with them on this incredibly difficult fight. Some have questioned whether all 50,000 consultation responses could have been adequately analyzed in such a short time frame. The Times understands that the guidance is still being finalized and it will not decree that services have to provide single-sex spaces, but that if they do, for example, if a lavatory is intended for women, transgender women would be excluded from using it. To allow someone of the opposite sex to use the facilities would be very likely to amount to unlawful discrimination. But for some reason, it's not unlawful discrimination to allow someone that identifies as the gender that you would most commonly expect a person of a specific sex to identify with, who was not assigned said sex at birth, but in spite of that, might even have a variety of secondary sex characteristics that make them more recognizable in public as that sex and the gender commonly associated with it. That's not discrimination, of course. It would also make clear that it will not be deemed as discrimination to exclude trans people from those facilities, and that services will be allowed to request birth certificates to ensure single-sex services are protected. Huh? Request birth certificates. I assume this is like for things where like you're signing up for something, let's say. So let's say you're trying to get a gym membership. They're going to be able to request your birth certificate to see what your biological sex was marked as. I wonder how far reaching that is. Like imagine like you're in a restaurant and they have a single sex bathroom or whatever, and you got to take a piss after having, you know, had your dinner. And they're like, okay, well, where's your birth certificate so we can see which bathroom you're meant to go in? Seems, seems pretty normal, totally. I would like to think that's not the way that works, but, you know, stranger things have happened. We're already operating in an irrational capacity, given everything we've already read about how the EHRC and UK Labour, who's supporting a lot of this anti-trans shit, is interpreting everything. So it would not be shocking that whole manner of, you know, logical extensions that you could arrive at, even if they seem irrational, might still be something that happens. The draft guidance also said that in certain circumstances, a trans person could be excluded from a service even if it matched their biological sex. It read, quote, "A legitimate aim for excluding a trans person from a separate or single-sex service for their own biological sex might be to prevent alarm or distress for other service users. Don't worry about the alarm or distress of the trans person. They are not full humans like cisgender people. They are not worthy of the same consideration that people who identify with the gender that is most commonly associated with their biological sex that was assigned when they were born through no choice of their own. Those people are more human than a trans person, and therefore their alarm or distress, hypothetical or otherwise, is more important." Now, I do believe that most of the anti-trans people would be like, oh, well, we could just, these services and whatnot could just have an additional gender-neutral bathroom or whatever. This is only for single-sex services. A lot of places only have one bathroom or two. You'll have like one bathroom that's unisex or whatever. It's all gender, and it's like a single room with a door that locks, essentially a single stall. When it comes to different bathrooms that have a whole bunch of different stalls and whatnot, those ones are going to be where this is going to be enforced, obviously, because those are going to be dictated as single sex or separate. But if it's the case that in certain circumstances a trans person could be excluded from a service even if it matched their biological sex, there's so much gray area and non-specificity when it comes to the way that this is being laid out, that like I feel like if you didn't want a person that you suspect to be trans to be able to comfortably be in your establishment, you know, use the restroom if they have to, whatever, you'll probably be able to find a way to make that happen and be able to discriminate against them in that way. Like I think the platonic ideal would be all bathrooms are all gender, because they're the kind of bathrooms where you go in and you'll have like the line of the sinks and all of that is like relatively open, and then you'll have a bunch of stalls that instead of like being American style stalls that like 10 feet of open viewing between like the door and what the door is mounted on and the underneath and above of the door as well, they would be like individual rooms. You would have a room that has a door that locks that you could go into to use the bathroom. So you would have a little lobby area with all the sinks and whatnot, and then you would have individual rooms that have your toilet and whatnot that you could then go into, lock, and they are single use that way. It seems like that's like the easiest way to do this for any kind of larger restroom option, because you don't really need a gender discrepancy there. because everybody that is going to be using the bathroom, the lobby area where the sinks and whatnot are, is open enough that anybody passing by or anybody in there is able to see if anything untoward is happening. And then when you need your privacy, when you're using the toilet, that is behind a door with a lock that nobody can see into. That has always made the most sense to me. For establishments that only have single room bathrooms, and either they have a single one that's technically all gender, or if there's two of those different rooms, one for men and one for women, they have like the little stick figure without the skirt and the stick figure with the skirt on them, but those are usually only single use as well. Those kinds of bathrooms, if you're an establishment of that size, having a third bathroom, you might not even be able to do that. If you've ever been in a public establishment, an eatery, a shop, or whatever, they might only have the two bathrooms. I don't think you could reasonably expect a person with an establishment of that size who only has a male and female bathroom to be able to construct a third transgender bathroom. Right? So the idea that these smaller establishments, you know, the argument being like, oh, it's not discrimination because even though we're excluding trans people from using these separate or single-sex bathrooms or what have you, it doesn't disallow for trans people to use an all-gender bathroom or a bathroom that allows for trans people to be able to use the restroom with dignity. In many instances, that might not even be a physical possibility for the establishment owner. They might not have the square footage, they might not have the capital to be able to pay for the building of it. So in many instances, if you have two bathrooms, a men's room and a women's room, you're either going to keep it a men's room and a women's room, and then the trans person that's unlucky enough to have to use the restroom in your establishment might be subject to scrutiny. If you're a woman that has a little bit of visible mustache hair, like cis women get. Also, what the fuck? Hello? It's actually a ghost fucking with my lights. What was I talking about? It'll allow for a lot of ability for establishment owners, if they happen to not like trans people very much, to find whatever excuse they need to not allow for that trans person to be able to use the restroom and therefore exist in public in their establishment comfortably, right? And that allows for a version of discrimination that might make it less likely that a trans person goes to your place of business. And if you're a private enterprise, like, you can have your moral disagreements or whatever, but a private enterprise will often, unless subject to laws dictating that they cannot discriminate against people in that way, obviously in this case that's potentially being allowed by the government that you can make that legalese argument of like, oh, well, it's a private business, they're allowed to serve who they want and whatnot. But you're getting dangerously close to, well, what if I just don't want a trans person in my place of business at all? And at that point, you're reaching a level of like obvious bigotry that isn't this kind of like more comfortable to people who are bigoted against trans people but aren't very open about it, that they're okay with. You're getting further than that and essentially being like, well, I don't want any trans people in my place of business either. I'll turn you away if you're trans. Most people would find that to be a very obvious version of discrimination that shouldn't be tolerated, because you wouldn't tolerate it about any kind of other minority group. Like you would turn away black people, brown people, people of religious minorities, etc., etc. That would obviously be seen as discrimination. For trans people, it should be the same thing, but they're allowing, you know, these different firms to have a bit of wiggle room to decide if they want to pursue an establishment that's not friendly for trans people or doesn't allow for trans people to exist within it or be patrons of it in a comfortable way. And when it comes to any kind of public facility managed by the government, I guess we'll see how that shakes out, because at that point you don't have the, well, I'm a private business owner and I should be allowed to serve who I want or whatever. You don't even have that argument anymore, because you're a governmental institution that is ostensibly supposed to serve all of the people in your country, right? Like, that's the entire point of having a state, is that it's supposed to be able to provide for the people living within it and allow them to live lives of dignity. And if you are a governmental entity, you might have the capital to be able to build a third bathroom for the trans-only bathroom or whatever, but it's still pretty cooked either way. So the shit continues, quote, a trans man might be excluded from the women-only service if the service provider decides that because he presents as a man, other service users could reasonably object to his presence, and it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim to exclude him. So a trans man might be excluded from a women-only service, even though that trans man is, by their definition, technically a female and therefore should be allowed within a women-only service. Because that person presents as a man, they might also be able to not allow them. If you're a trans man, You can't go into the men's room because you're not a biological man in their eyes. So therefore, you shouldn't be allowed to go into that bathroom because we're trying to be very binary, anti-scientific, etc., about the difference between biological sex and the social concept of gender, and the fact that biological sex in itself isn't binary and is actually a bimodal distribution of different secondary sex characteristics, intersex people existing, whatever. All the factual information isn't really relevant to this case, apparently. So, like, you can exclude a trans man from being in a men's only service because that person is technically a biological woman in their eyes, but you can also exclude a trans man who is in their eyes technically a biological female from a women only service because that woman doesn't sufficiently look enough like a woman to you. That's essentially what they're saying. Because he presents as a man, I guess they're gonna have like a governmental body that's meant to, I guess, lay out the rules and regulations behind how men are supposed to look and present themselves in public, and how women are supposed to look and present themselves in public. Like, how are people expected to be able to follow these absurd guidelines? Like, you gotta lay it out at least. I think the UK government should have to do that. Because otherwise, it's so gray area, you could just deny any trans person from using any facility and make it so that they're not really able to exist in public comfortably, which might be the goal of the people pushing these kinds of legal arguments that are anti-scientific and dubious in their actual accuracy when it comes to even the legal side of that argument. But if it wasn't the case that that was their ultimate goal or their unwritten goal, the way you're going about it is already so inept and amateurish that it just doesn't make sense. The UK, whoever's in power there, I guess it's Labour currently, should have to put forward a guideline for how you're supposed to present yourself in public as a man and how you're supposed to present yourself as a woman in public. And any biological female who happens to, by her genetics, land squarely in the biological understanding of what a female is, have the correct chromosomes, have the correct secondary sex characteristics, but might present in such a way that is more masculine, so say she likes to wear a binder so that she doesn't have very visible, if visible at all, breasts. And she might not shave the small amount of mustache that even biological females, scary thought, I know, for a lot of people out there, a lot of conservatives, they do grow body hair as well, and even facial hair in many instances. They have to do a little bit of shaving to, cover that up. There's even a whole, line of products and strategies behind makeup that allows for the covering of that up in biological females. If essentially a butch lesbian who identifies as a woman is a biological female by their definition, by the UK government's definition, but presents as a man, quote unquote, or at least close enough, because there's no actual guidelines put out, services might be able to deny them access to both options, both single-sex services. You're not allowed in the men's room because you're a biological woman, but you're also not allowed in the women's room because you are a butch lesbian and like to present yourself in a very masculine way that most people would expect a man to present as. It's just, this is like a very long roundabout way of essentially strengthening the, because of actual feminist work, weakening of the strict adherence to gender roles that, society was plagued with for a long time. The idea that women have to, look a certain way, and, it was the case for so long that the way women ought to look, quote unquote, by the dictates of society was usually decided by men, and it was usually for the viewing pleasure of men, and the way men ought to look, etc., etc. It's just a way of going back in time to greener pastures, brighter days for the conservative, for the people who are so insecure with their own sense of self that seeing somebody who might have, the same biological sex as they are look in a way that you wouldn't normally expect to see that biological sex. It's just a way for them to feel a little bit better about themselves. It doesn't help anybody, it only hurts people. The guidance will also say services will need to consider whether there is a suitable alternative for trans people to use. In the case of areas that are necessary for everyone, such as lavatories, it would not be proportionate to leave a trans person with no facilities. So what are you going to do then? Sure, maybe governmental establishments might be able to afford the building of an additional all-gender bathroom so that trans people are able to have a bathroom if they can't use either of the single-sex ones. But what about, your mom and pop businesses that only have 2 bathrooms, male and female? either it's up to that business owner to essentially dictate that both of those bathrooms are all gender, which might be more difficult if it's, you know, a bathroom with several stalls that is not in the same orientation as I described earlier. Those kind of bathrooms where it's behind a door, many people are going to have more concerns about their own privacy, whereas what I described earlier, if you have a bathroom like that and it's male only, female only, you're not really going to be able to make it all gender and have people be more comfortable with that. You kind of need the more lobby arrangement for people to be more comfortable with an all gender bathroom in that way because of those single use stalls with a locked door that nobody can see into, right? You might not have the money as a small mom and pop business owner to be able to build a new bathroom for all gender or trans people, or to remodel your existing bathroom to be able to be comfortably an all gender bathroom or whatever. So what then? Is the government gonna subsidize the construction of those bathrooms or the construction of the remodeling? Because if they're not, then you're just going to be left with a whole bunch of businesses that are going to have to deal with it and, you know, shoulder the burden of terrible law, and it's not going to benefit anybody. Like, there's no actual reason for doing this in the first place. But should it be done, even if that business owner is very accepting of trans people and gender nonconforming people, they might not have the square footage. They might not have the money to properly create all gender bathrooms in that way unless they have the single room with a door with a lock, right? If they have something that is like a door and then a bunch of stalls and it's more closed off than what I was talking about earlier, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually make a comfortable space for all people. But that's kind of the point, right? The whole point here is to make it so that, in spite of, you know, addressing very vaguely the, oh, well, there should be an alternative for trans people to use, it's probably not going to end up working out to be the case that there is. And it's just going to make it so that existing in public as a trans person is more difficult because everybody needs to use the bathroom. It's just a fact of life. No matter how much you might dislike that, it is what it is. People gotta shit and piss, and they should be able to do so in a dignified way. To make it so that because of how you look, you can't use a bathroom, and because of your biological sex, you can't use the other bathroom or whatever, essentially makes it so that the only place you really can comfortably use the bathroom is your own home, and it means that you can't be out in public strengthening your local economy by going to various businesses and supporting them that way, or going out and volunteering, or going out and doing recreational leisure activities. You're not going to be able to exist in public in the most comfortable way as cisgender people are able to enjoy, because there isn't any facility that will allow you to be there with dignity. And that's kind of the point, obviously. It's tired to bring this up at this point, but the closer and closer you get to stupid ass laws being written, the more you're going to have to talk about it, because the actual way these things are going to manifest are going to matter. You can opine on the idea all you want in your fantasies as a transphobic person. When the rubber actually meets the fucking road and you gotta figure out how the shit's actually gonna work, it's a little bit harder to be as openly bigoted as you want to. And even your covert bigotry option, like what is being described in these EHRC guidelines, is not super easy either, right? You might as well just go all out and say that we don't want trans people to exist. It might be harder socially for you to get away with that. It's certainly going to be simpler for your feeble mind to comprehend. Staff will be able to make inquiries about a person's birth sex or legal changes made to their gender, but said this could be classed as discrimination if it was not done in a sensitive way. Is it like a case-by-case basis where, like, if you're a butch lesbian who identifies as a woman and was born biologically female, and you tick every single possible box that these lunatic transphobes are looking for how a woman ought to be, but you're a butch lesbian, so you look too masculine for their liking, are they allowed to ask for your government papers and see what genitals you might have? You know, call me crazy, but I happen to be of the opinion that that's none of your fucking business. You know, I happen to be someone who believes in individual liberty and personal freedom, and I don't like the idea of the state or even private enterprise being able to inquire about if I have a dick or not and what direction it bends, you know? Like, this is not information that they need. It's not relevant to them in any way. But apparently, you know, there are genital inspectors out there that want it to happen. The source said, quote, "The EHRC does know what the law is and can't publish final guidance that is in complete contravention of the Supreme Court verdict. Campaigners have accused the EHRC of, quote, ignoring their views because it used artificial intelligence to categorize the replies to the consultation." That's what I was getting at earlier. They used AI to categorize the replies to the consultation. 50,000 people that replied to it, they used AI in order to help them go through it all. Don't worry about anything like that. I'm sure it's totally fine to use such things in your government because nobody wants to fucking work anymore. Insider said this was a practice that had been rolled out across government departments to save civil servants time. Nobody wants to work anymore, folks. It's a big problem. A source at a national LGBT organization familiar with the guidance said, quote, "The EHRC received 50,000 responses to its consultation, and to consider them all in the past 27 working days would have required viewing over 1,850 submissions a day. This is an extraordinarily short time frame, especially given the number of complex legal questions raised by businesses, organizations, and the public. The speed with which the EHRC must have addressed each of the serious concerns, which included questions of compatibility with existing legislation, will be somewhat surprising to those that have spent many hours engaging with this process." The HRC said it was, quote, "working at pace to finalize the guidance and that services were, quote, obliged to comply with the law as set out by the Supreme Court." A spokesman said, "The code of practice has not yet been finalized. We received an extremely high volume of responses to the consultation and are grateful to everyone who shared their feedback. To ensure we give these responses the consideration they merit, we are working at pace to analyze them and are amending the draft code of practice text where necessary to make it as clear and helpful as possible. But our code will remain consistent with the law set out by the Supreme Court." The spokesman added that, quote, "supervised use of AI was in place, quote, alongside our expert legal assessment to ensure a balance of robustness, accuracy, and speed, including promoting consistently and helping to avoid bias in managing the scale of responses." Maybe just like take your time and have the people that are paid to review all of these and understand legal arguments behind them and each of these nuanced and complicated responses to the consultation, maybe just like have the people whose job it is to do that take their time to do that then. It might be the case that in many instances of anti-trans legislation being pushed, the people that are behind it, the anti-queer bigots that are behind it, are working backward from their conclusion. Their conclusion being they do not want trans people to exist. You can't really do that in a way that the public will allow you to do. So you got to move the goalposts a little bit. Well, now we don't want trans people to be able to exist in public in a dignified and comfortable way. We want to institute conditions of life in public that are so uncomfortable to the point where it forces trans people to be out in public less, and therefore the people who are anti-queer or whatever, who are so insecure with themselves that they externalize their insecurity onto other people who are doing things that they can't even imagine being able to be confident enough to do themselves, like self-actualization and understanding that it requires to go against the overwhelming tide of social inertia and stigma that women ought be this way, and to contradict that and be more masculine, etc. The level of awareness of the human experience, the transphobes can't comprehend being that in touch with humanity, with the human experience, being that equipped to understand those kinds of thought processes, even if they don't apply them themselves, but even to empathize with people. It makes it so that they can be a little bit more comfortable because they have to be forced to suffer the experience of bearing witness a trans person in public a little bit less, because it's going to be harder for trans people to exist in public because of this shit. That's the conclusion that they have, and every single kind of fucking Rube Goldberg measure that they put forward, where they'll institute one thing and then have to find a way to fix an obvious problem in what they want to do, because what they want to do is irrational. None of that would be a problem if they weren't working backward from their conclusion, but they so clearly are. So they're just going to very quickly use AI to help categorize the 50,000 consultation responses and be able to get out this kind of precedent for oppression of a minority group, in this case trans people, as quickly as possible. Maybe because they feel pressure, the people in power in the UK. Maybe they're concerned about their potential ability to succeed in future elections that might arise. Who knows?